Good evening, and welcome to the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, and to the 7th season of the General Society Artisan Lecture Series. My name is Victoria Dangle, and I'm the Executive Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen. This program is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council and the Friends of the Artisan Lecture Series. And for those of you less familiar with the Society, just some brief introductory remarks regarding it. The General Society was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City, artisans who represented 22 different trades, including carpenters, saddlers, tailors, and silversmiths, among others. Today, our 232-year-old organization continues to serve the people of the City of New York through our education and cultural programs, including our Mechanics Institute, which is a tuition-free program for people in the building trades, the General Society Library, which you are in tonight, and our public program lecture series. We do 24 lectures a year. We invite you to become a member of this wonderful library. You can join for as little as $35. If you can prove you're a senior citizen, and we're very tough about IDing you. And we also invite you, we have the Mossman collection of locks upstairs, which is a collection of 350 locks and keys, all chronicled in a book called The Lore of the Lock, and it's really worth your time afterwards, and it's really the best view in the house, I have to say, from that balcony. The Artisan Lecture Series is co-curated by Rhett Butler, owner and founder of E.R. Butler, as well as Jean Wiart, a master ornamental metal worker, and the original curator of the Artisan Lecture Series. And so tonight, we gather once more to pay tribute to the art of craftsmanship with a particular focus on interior design this evening. The Artisan Lecture Series has committed itself to giving voice to internationally known artisans who will talk about the intricacies of their specialized crafts. The mission of the Artisan Lecture Series is to promote the work and art of skilled craftsmen to assist in ensuring that their unique knowledge is understood and carried forth for generations to come. I am pleased to present Karen Taylor, who is our program director of the Society, who will introduce our panelists for this evening. So thank you.
Good evening. A very warm welcome to the General Society, as Victoria has just said. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our panelists this evening, who are here to celebrate the publication of New York Living, Reinventing Home. And one of the co-authors, Paul Gunther, is president tonight. Paul is also executive director of Gracie Mansion Conservancy. And two of the featured designers, Tamara Eaton and Kraig, are also present. I would also like to thank Nora Hennigan, the publicist for Rizzoli New York, for all her assistance. And above all, I want to mention Mick Hales, who is the photographer of this absolutely gorgeous book. That's a fantastic book, which will also be for sale at the end of the evening. I'm just going to give you a brief bio of our three panelists. Paul Gunther is a veteran of the New York art and design world, joining the Gracie Mansion Conservancy as executive director after 35 years as an author, consultant, and executive in the field of historic preservation, land use, and cultural institutions. Tamara Eaton was named a curbed top young designer and has carved out an immense following in New York and beyond since she launched her firm in 2009. She has worked on multiple high-profile homes throughout the tri-state area. Her firm also designs commercial and hospitality spaces and has designed for multiple prestigious charity events. Her work has been featured in Architectural Digest, Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, and Luxe Magazine. She currently has over 15 projects under construction. Kraig is an award-winning New York City-based creative who has been immersed in the international design scene and active as a tastemaker for over 20 years. always engaged in cutting-edge design, Mr. Kraig is the principal of Kraig Studio, which creates environments for residential and commercial spaces. To launch this evening, it's my great pleasure to now introduce Paul Gunther. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be here. I have a very special memory of this stage, which for many years I ran something called the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, which is housed in this building, along with what we used to have at art school here called Grand Central Academy. But I would come in, and 4 times a year, as I recall, Karen might remember, there's a breakfast here for an organization called Women in Real Estate, and it's very, very well attended. And this is where I heard Ivanka Trump talk about women in real estate. And I have to tell you, she was very impressive. Anyway, that's all I have to say. She was very beautiful as well. I want to say that I have, just to cue the violins, I have Lyme disease and babsiosis at the same time. So I'm somewhere between a petri dish and a pharmaceutical laboratory. So if I'm vaguely incoherent, that's why. So honestly, I go to the end of the North Fork, which is Orient, and Henrika, a couple of people have been here, and if you look out from my house, to the left is Lyme, and to the right is Old Lyme. So there you go. So before I start with some of these slides, I wanted to read a brief part of my introduction, which is something that's very much on my mind in undertaking this book. So if you'll bear with me, I'd like to read this section. The boundary-breaking geography of the 21st century's first quarter parallels and reinforces the various formal design responses in disparate neighborhoods which history has shaped. Recent design accomplishment in New York is a story of complex variety. This essential fact drives this content. Yet there is no claim here of some complete, comprehensive inventory of exceptional work, as that would be as impossible as illusory, a fool's errand among such abundant accomplishment. I approached this with great modesty, as did my partners Gay Giordano and Mick Hales, the photographer. Instead, it is an exemplary and subjective sampling of design accomplishment driven both by borough and style, an introductory assemblage of what is really taking place here. This book features the work of acknowledged experts as well as autodidactic design adventures of the residents of themselves, DIY, as we now say. In like spirit, this book, or any book like this, pricks the raw nerve of urban gentrification and its frequent potential for the displacement of existing communities that are in many cases, in most cases, a far cry from the abandoned quote-unquote ghettos of prejudicial assumption. Filmmaker and activist Spike Lee labels it the Christopher Columbus syndrome, quote, "You can't discover this. We've been here. You can't just come and bogart," which is a verb I should use more. But anyway, if you don't know what that means, you could look it up on Urban Dictionary. Indeed, all the models discovered here arise in places where others have lived before and where a neighborhood's prior fabric still exists, even in those cases when frayed by the threads of greater affluence and its resulting shifts, which is in many cases de-densification. As a result, that is a very important consideration in looking at these projects. This book is a parable of the design progress, acknowledging that what some groups deem improvement is also commensurate loss, not only of individual homes, but of, in some cases, the binding, affordable communities that gave rise to them in the first place. The great challenge in the New York of the new century's adolescence is not, in my view, some quixotic campaign to stop the inexorable forces of an underlying market economy, but to shift planning policy in ways fostering diversity and access. The result is community strengthening through addition, not subtraction. a kind of gentrification for all, especially those already calling these sections of the five boroughs home. So I did take that very seriously, and I know many design professionals do so as well, especially as in my thesis again, I start the book with that famous anecdote of two society ladies, one saying to the other, oh, I saw this wonderful play at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and the other says, and you must go see it, and the other one says, no, no, dear, I'll catch it in London. So, which I'm sure is, I'm sure it's apocryphal, but nonetheless, it did describe certainly even the New York that I moved to in the mid-late 70s. In my theory, the boundaries have blurred. The subway lines, especially for younger people, don't have the same significance or the same barriers. And of course, let me stress that for many others before, that was a non-issue in any case. So I just want to give that signal up front. But within that context, it's my thesis that we're in a golden age of design in New York. And if I can get this to work, I have colleagues from many different parts of my life. And as I've indicated, if anyone can screw it up, I can. The on button. Well, there, see, I'm proof. Voila. So I believe it's a golden age of residential design, and I have several reasons why I think that's so. So this is my hypothesis, and I don't think I probably have proven it, but it's what I set out to demonstrate. It's certainly something that other people have addressed before. I'm not claiming to invent anything, I'm trying to put it together. But for these various reasons, I think it is this golden age of residential design. They are geography, I'll return to these, wealth, or I should say wealth concentration, an absence of design polemics, materials and technology, talent, client consciousness, and then the social contract, the underlying, it's tied to geography, but nonetheless goes more to the point of neighborhoods that were somehow deemed off limits to the touch of the professional designer and now very much are. So I covered all five boroughs when I went with my partners and Charles Davey, who is another part of this book, to Rizzoli. I did pitch it essentially as the five boroughs. Hardly a radical idea, but somewhat new, and within the purview of high-end design books, it hadn't quite been undertaken. By the way, I want to say up front, I feel in many ways I've failed at that. I take a stab at it, but I see this enterprise as a challenge. For example, in the Bronx, I felt very disappointed at what I could discover, even though I'm sure that there's a lot going on there. But I sure tried. Anyway, so there's David Mann in New York, Manhattan, Tamara Eaton, one of our panelists in Brooklyn, Laura Heim in Sunnyside, Queens, in the historic Sunnyside district, Steve Burns in Riverdale, a great garden, English suburban garden suburb that calls itself New York City, and Chris Kraig, another panelist. I favor Chris and Tamara. I felt that was only fair, who we'll get to later. So first, geography. I have just a couple examples. I'm not going to go into too much here. Wait one sec. I wanted to get my timer on. Oh dear, I can't see. You can't. No matter what it is, I can't do it. Yeah. Voila. So geography. This is very basically the five boroughs. The premise I made before that in the past, especially in the 20th century, that would have been an unlikely enterprise when examining interior design. I'm going to be doing a program at the New York School of Interior Design later, and I was alarmed, don't quote me, but I was alarmed when I said, what are your students doing in the Bronx, in Staten Island? And they drew a complete blank. So we've got a long way to go, but clearly it's on their minds, and those are the kinds of projects that they'll be turning to for budgets and for for nothing else. So the examples I have of that kind of geographic spread are Rod Keenan and Philip Howitt Jabor in Harlem. Rod is with us. Rod had been a long time resident of Harlem with some friends of mine. He, now that he's here, I'm nervous I'll get it right, but I'll give you the gist. He had lived there, he explored, he found basically an abandoned city property. He was able to purchase that from the city. What year was it, Rod? 2000. The year 2000. I believe the rule was that he had to use city labor or city contractors in doing the renovation, but otherwise it was effectively an abandoned, we used to say in rem property. So he didn't displace anybody, but he came into a neighborhood that since then, of course, has changed dramatically. Another example is Park Slope. In the 1890 census, I discovered that, interestingly enough, Park Slope was the richest neighborhood in all of America. Obviously, in the 20th century, that changed, and it went through a sort of downward spiral in terms of at least its socioeconomic ranking. Many of the homes were split up. To say Park Slope has been discovered is very, very old news indeed, but in this instance, it has reemerged not only as a place for preservation and DIY intervention, but a place where people like Tamara are being brought in with considerable budget and with a great blank slate of possibilities. And finally, one of the two ground-up projects that I feature in the book. This is by Grzywinski and Pons in Bayside. This is in a neighborhood of Tudor Revival homes. To respect the context, they actually started below ground, went down in the ground so that it wouldn't exceed the height of the surrounding, but it's a radical departure. Nonetheless, a neighborhood that hadn't had new freestanding homes built in a very, very long time. And finally, Chris lives in the Stapleton Heights area of the northern side of Staten Island, above St. George. It's the St. Paul's Historic District. He'll be telling you more, but indeed, this is not a neighborhood that you would have found great talent like Chris until the recent past. Some of you may know Staten Island. I have great respect for all new houses on Staten Island. Nonetheless, the design standard is not a universally accepted one for many of the properties. I'm trying to be nice. So and there were a lot of interesting fabric there that's been compromised and blown up and disruptive of the underlying fabric. Chris found a solution there, and it's a very exciting one, which he'll tell you about. Oops. Wait. Oh, and the last one was the Bronx. Steve Bird, sorry. So wealth. This is obvious. We all know this story. Let me get my notes here. Forgive me. The average apartment in New York, now I looked at the latest Zillow numbers, is $2 million. In the 5 boroughs, it's $657,000, about $884 a square foot. So this is the problem I referred to in the beginning. Nonetheless, there is this sufficient density of wealth that more and more properties can be developed, more and more properties can be put in play, more and more people can hire professionals to help them with their vision or to create their vision in the first place. This can't have happened. This obviously, none of this would have happened without this. We all know about the 57th Street. I live on a block on 10th Street between 5th and 6th, which presently has 5 townhouses being restored back to single-family homes. In one instance, 3 homes that were cut up are going back to as one family. So what I counted approximately 28 units is going to 1. So that's the extreme example of this wealth, but across the board, there's a willingness for people to invest in New York, and they want to do it with their homes. That's where their hearts lie, that's where their futures lie, in some cases where their families are going to be raised, and this is a phenomenon that's going on. We all know many people are more interested in their real estate and in their properties than, say, clothes or other things that past generations have valued. So I'm taking sort of high-end examples, very high-end examples. This is Sau and McCown. It's a 12,000 square foot townhouse on the Upper East Side that they completely gutted. It did have a lot of historic fabric, but the client had no interest in it. Some of the renovation, if you see the book, in fact has references to the classical orders in a very chic, modern way, but nonetheless they wanted it gutted and started from the get-go. So they did so, and why not? This is it's complete surfaces, all the chimneys, all the floors, all the wood, everything was fully replaced. They wanted nothing to be left as they started their work. The next one is Workshop APD. This is the Jean Nouvel building in the West Village High Line, next to the Gary building. You may know it. Extremely large, 4,500 square foot, with a 4,500 square foot outdoor terrace, same size. Very respectful of the Jean Nouvel fenestration, but they wanted, apart from that, a very dramatic rupture, their own vision. They didn't want the starchitecture of Nouvel to alter their interior. So again, they bought there, they made a nod to it, but they wanted something completely different, and the budget was there to do so. And finally, John Murray. This is was 2 floors of the Majestic. It was not a duplex, but the client bought both. And for one reason is they loved English traditional design and Art Deco. So they charged to John Murray was to devote a floor to each style. One is English traditional and one is Art Deco. So, why not to have 2 floors? So they were able to combine them. The third one is absence of polemics. Some of you are many of you are design professionals. Maybe have a distorted view of this, but I studied architectural history. I had a partner for many years who was a very, very edgy modernist, but I was also head at the same time of this Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. So I'm very used to the polemics of design. And what's clear to me and clear to many of you is that the fact is, unlike past generations, there is no reigning polemic. There is no dominant force. When I run Gracie Mansion, if you know Gracie Mansion, the house was 1799, but a wing was added in 1966 by the architect Matt Schmidt under the watch of Mayor Wagner. It's called the Susan Wagner Wing. And when that was built, it was considered a moral outrage of almost unspeakable horror, because it was a Federal Revival classical addition to the original house. Matt Schmidt was one of the very few practitioners in classical design, and it was the last of his career. He was really the last of the Mohicans. So again, my theory is that that's kind of, this simply doesn't exist, and in any case, there are many, many more practitioners and tradespeople and skilled builders who can meet that bill. So I argue that anything goes, basically. And so this is Clem Labine, this is Park Slope. He was a pioneer. He bought this brownstone in Park Slope in 1967 for $32. No, I'm not in the $32, but $25,000 or something. So he took it. He said the hell with currency. I'm gonna reinterpret it in the most literal way. I'll keep the fabric that's here. I'll add the fabric back that wasn't here. He's probably he's probably outdone the original, but it's an exquisite example of aesthetic movement and high Victorian design. It's very beautiful if you haven't been there. Then is Amy Shakespeare here? One of the architects is named Amy Shakespeare, which is an incredibly chic name, but she's supposed to be here. But this is, again, a bit of the antithesis, because this was a Park Slope a townhouse. Her firm is called Red Top, And in this case, it did have fabric, but they gutted it out completely. So this is a little bit like the Tsao and McNown on the Upper East Side, where the client emphatically said, no, I don't really give a damn about what might be residual from the past, and started fresh. And then the last one is this wonderful sort of DIY house in Staten Island, I think near probably still in the St. Paul district of Staten Island. And this is a Empire Louis, why am I blanking? Blanking. Louis, Napoleon III. And the outside, like so much of Staten Island, the outside is aluminum, completely shorn of any decoration. He's decided that that not only would it be not worth doing the outside, but that it would actually detract from its value. Nonetheless, the inside, he put back, again, he'd sort of said, the heck with anything else that's going on, I'm going to respect and really outdo the original impulse. He has a very fine eye, but he brought back any possible proportion or detail that he could find hidden away. Interestingly enough, it's very interesting, some of you may know this, when they started building in Staten Island, even though they were freestanding houses, there was still this interest in urbanity and the idea of a townhouse. So in many ways, they built it as though it were a townhouse, including building from below grade, so that the dining room is like a dining room in a brownstone in a townhouse in Manhattan, where you're below grade and the windows are a little higher and you're coming up. It's very interesting, their view of it. Materials and technology, you could talk about this forever, but one of them is Joel Sanders. This is the Time Warner building. This glass is called switchlight glass. Those are the showers, and the bathrooms are all transparent. Other people are doing this, but there's this wonderful thing, if you don't know, called switchlight, which steams up and turns the glass into a translucent but barrier. So all that can suddenly become private. He's used a very fine new material on the ceiling that bounces off the reflection of the park. It was his idea to make the sort of interior look like the park was sort of slipping inside. Likewise, another Bayside Queens, going back to Grzybinski and Pons, they had all kinds of material that's very interesting, including a particular emphasis on green design. All the flooring outside and in some cases inside the garage is permeable. They've used a variety of different pavers and tiles that now allow water to pass through. It's also below grade, so that was a factor for them. They've used different tiling and glazed granite, all kinds of new materials that were not possible before and were not always expensive. And lastly, Red Hook made, design, build. This is This is in Red Hook. Again, full of new materials, new supplies, a tough striated aluminum cladding. It's 3,000 square feet, and it has a very, in particular, very modern heat system that relies on it's radiant heat that relies on the stairway to pull it forward and move it out through the house. And lastly, Work AC in Soho, which again relies on every possible new material. This picture doesn't really do it justice. The interior kitchen is a bronze-backed material that's brand new, and it's thin, but the entire kitchen looks as if it's cast bronze with doors and closets concealed. It's pictured in the book. Talent. So here we go. I have a few statistics here to share, and there are, as of right now, as near as I could sort out, 16,515 architects in the 5 boroughs, which means 49 architects per 100,000 people. Now that, there are states with a higher ratio, and Washington, D.C. is the biggest the highest ratio. Nonetheless, that's a lot of architects. The enrollment at Pratt, Parsons, and NYSID in terms of interior design is extremely robust. NYSID in particular has grown in leaps and bounds, and it's clear, you're going to hear from two of them, that we've probably never had more talent. It's, I think, part of the zeitgeist, it's part of the culture, it's part of the interest people have, it's part of what's driving people in careers. But I did notice Anne Fairfax, who's an architect, some of you may know, on Facebook, listed a study that just came out of Princeton, I think, that said architectural undergraduates work harder in measurable hours than any other major, including pre-med. So there you go. And so that's, I nod to Rod, who is a milliner, interestingly enough. He did work with the designer, and he also got some help, I believe, from Jamie Drake, who's a very important interior designer and architect. But it's clear that this was driven within his budget by pure raw talent. Tamara, again, what can I say? She'll tell us more about her credentials and her background, but I believe her work is excellent, and Chris too, who again, in his case, I won't speak for him, but he had a limited budget. The site is a particularly difficult one, and it's sheer raw talent that allowed him to pull it off. Client consciousness, again, that's really the zeitgeist, again, the idea, the design, the obsession with design, this design magazines, the design blogs, the fascination with materials, and the proliferation of the profession. Steve Burns, again, in Riverside, in Riverdale, he is an architect. He's now head of the Untermeyer Gardens. He quit his profession to become the head of the famous Yonkers Garden that he's trying to restore. But obviously, he brought an exquisite, well-informed knowledge of design and objects to the project, and it guided him completely. It was all his sheer raw sophistication and talent. And this is Ivan Chermayeff. This is the famous graphic designer, and his son Sam. Ivan Chermayeff is now about 90. He's the graphic designer who brought Helvetica to America in the 60s. He did Life and Look and PBS and Mobil Oil and those sort of Mad Men logos that defined an era. And his son is now an architect. They worked with Donald Judd, Michael Graves, a number of people over the years. And it's really a collection of extreme sophistication and taste. Whether you like it or not, it's an extraordinary amalgam of talent. And this in Manhattan Valley, of client consciousness, and this finally Manhattan Valley. The firm is called Delson or Sherman. And this, while it had a very limited budget, the client was very heavily involved in determining the plan. It's basically a tenement building in Manhattan Valley. And I think you can sort of see from the materials and the joyful inclusion of their objects of their daily life as a measure of their assuredness with their own taste. In Harlem. It's sort of West Harlem. Yeah, Central West Harlem, yeah. And finally, lastly, this ties back to geography, and it ties back to gentrification, and ties back to all the controversial issues that my book, our book, touches on, and it acknowledges. But the fact that there are neighborhoods and areas where at least money wasn't brought in, the wealth or the determination of design intervention was not a recent phenomenon. So one of those is in Washington Heights, Hugo Martinez and Captain Rudnat. This is probably the chicest, this is the chicest project, if you will, in terms of edgy design. I had never heard of them, but when somebody, the dean of Columbia Architecture School said, "Oh my God, you have Captain Rudnat." Yeah, so I took that as a good thing. Anyway, so this was a really rough neighborhood, again, quote unquote rough. rough, not for the people that lived there, but he was able to get permission to extend. It's a very small apartment, but he was able to get the structure built that actually can be drawn into the house to change the interior to create a dining room, and then he can push it out when he wants to turn it back into a bedroom. So actually the interior, literally the definition of the interior moves in and out of the facade, the rear facade. This again, yet again, Gay, who put this together, clearly has you can tell, her favorite back in Bayside. But this was never really such a poor neighborhood, but it was also not a neighborhood where you would have had this kind of ground-up investment, where it would have been deemed a worthwhile or investment to build from the ground up, which is not easy in any part of New York. And this is the second ground up made in Red Hook, also a neighborhood. This was, as you know, the densest concentration of warehouse buildings. It's very much a mixed-use industrial neighborhood. So they made an acknowledgement to that context. But this is not a form or a typology that you saw until the very recent past. They full-fledged embrace of that industrial context. And that is effectively it. So I'm going to check on my timing to make sure I'm okay. Thank you for being patient. My drugs are definitely starting to kick in, but it's been a pleasure. So again, I want to conclude by stressing the sort of essential modesty of this, that I'm not pretending to do more than it is, but I am trying to at least start. It's such a cliche, but to start a conversation to discover more about what is going on in these other neighborhoods, so that they can be part of the design conversation at all levels, the elite level, the schools, and be aware of what's happening and what's possible, and also at all budgets, I hope. Now that's one thing. I don't want to go Rizzoli definitely, there's maybe a tilt towards the higher end, which is good, but there's lots of interesting work being done at lower budgets. Some of these are in here, but there's many, many more. So I would like to introduce now Chris Kraig. We'll just call him Mr. Kraig. And he is going to tell us about his project in Stapleton Heights, Staten Island.
But Paul, I don't have any pictures of Stapleton Heights.
Of Stapleton
I thought you
Heights?
were going to have them. I don't have any photographs of Stapleton Heights, unfortunately, because I thought they were going to be in Paul's presentation. No. But but I would love. Hi, I'm Chris Kraig, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much, Paul. What a pleasure to learn about the General Society today, and it's really fantastic. My first time here, and it's great to meet the staff and learn about this organization. And it's truly an honor to be here because I, most of all, enjoy working with the trades. And my own project in Stapleton, I worked with many of the trades. It was my newest thing. I'm going to see if I can get to my presentation here. I might need your help. I grew up in Chicago, and I was surrounded by all the great modern buildings of the time because the Bauhaus had basically moved there during before World War II. So I grew up around all the Mies van der Rohe towers, the great buildings by SOM, etc. I lived in a neighborhood called Beverly, which is on the city's south side, which is a very eclectic neighborhood. It had 19th century Queen Anne's next to Tudors from the 1920s. I walked past Frank Lloyd Wright House every day on my way to school. So from the beginning, I was always very interested in design and architecture, and growing up in that eclectic setting sort of set the standard for where I was going to go in my life. That said, I went to architecture school and I studied at the University of Illinois, and then I also studied fine art, interior architecture, and art history, and graduated from the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. So I was really immersed in sort of the Bauhaus tradition of learning about multiple mediums, shall we say. So I learned about architecture, I learned about painting, I learned about sculpture. I ultimately fell in love with modern furniture, and I opened a store when I graduated that sold 20th century American furniture. So I was selling the Herman Millers, the Knowles, Paul McCobb, et cetera, because I thought I was in Chicago. I would sell American furniture from the 20th century. This was in the mid-1990s, so talk about polemics, when everyone was going postmodern, and I, of course, was always rebelling, and in school I rebelled against all my postmodern friends who were imitating Michael Graves, et cetera. I wanted to do Mies van der Rohe, and I wanted to do super modern things. So I started selling 20th century in the mid-1990s. Moved to Los Angeles, where I could be around all the great modern masters of the West Coast, Richard Neutra, Rudolf Schindler, et cetera, where I continued to sell modern furniture and work on interiors as well. And then I finally said, okay, I need to go to New York. So I came to New York and became the creative director of sort of the design store besides Moss in the 1990s and early 2000s, Troy. And being the creative director there, I had the opportunity to travel all over the world and procure not only vintage pieces from the likes of the south of France, Germany, Paris, London, Copenhagen, Brazil, etc., but also to engage and meet all of the fresh young talent that was out there. And some of the older talent, great people like Martin Van Severen, who we were the first to bring to New York. So it was an incredible experience and an incredible time. This was mostly pre-9/11. So that said, I've always had an interest in modern furniture and contemporary design. And while looking through many of the images in Paul's book, I've noticed many of the pieces that I've procured for Sweet New York, where I'm the current creative director in Tamara's projects and other projects. So happy to see that. That said, I lived in Manhattan, of course. Then I was living in a brownstone in Carroll Gardens in Brooklyn, and I've always had a love and an affinity for old houses. And after a breakup, I said, where am I going to move next? I lived in Manhattan, I lived in Brooklyn. I said, I think Staten Island has some interesting history. So let me take a look. And I actually found my house in Staten Island on Craigslist, of all places. I went out there, and I met my new landlord. His name is Bob McAndrews, and he and his wife were baby boomers who, like many other baby boomers in the 1970s, wanted to live in a grand Victorian house. So they purchased this grand Victorian house when they were in their 30s. I met them, 30 years later. And I said, Bob, I would love to live in your house if you let me, it was kind of in shambles at that point, work in the garden and do some restoration work on my side. And he said, yes, I would love to do that. So this is an image of what my living room looked like before. You only got to see a couple of images of what my living room looked like, with the Eames chair. Tamara said the zebra head pillow, which I found in the Hamptons. Some 18th century art that I had inherited from my Aunt Irene, who I adore. She would always say, hey, you want to take this? Take it out of here. And I was like, great, Eventually I got to restore those paintings. Coupled in that image was also a contemporary mobile by an artist that I had found upstate. So I have this love for old houses and an affinity for them. I also have a love for modern furniture, contemporary design, and I think it's just a love for learning about new things and trying to preserve old things and create beauty where maybe beauty has been lost. So this was my living room prior to when I moved in, and that was my fireplace. I thought there's a great picture of the fireplace in the book. I'll show you guys later if you want to take a look. The mantelpiece was nailed to the wall down in the basement, and I had a great Polish artisan who lived down the street who did restoration work. So we brought it up in the basement, we stripped it of its paint, we got it refinished. It's fantastic. The history of that house is also amazing. The name of the street is Smith Terrace. It is the Smith House. I am now calling it Smith Terrace. My landlord told me it was an 1840s Greek revival, but obviously it's not. It's a 1840s early Italianate. It's very Andrew Jackson Downing. If you take a look, it would be called a Etruscan revival, and you saw pictures of it. Sorry, I don't have more. But I fell in love with the place. What I'm going to show you currently is a project that's not even in New York. This is a place upstate that I purchased about 5 years ago. And I just wanted to talk about it because it was a nearly 200-year-old house. The original owner came from Connecticut in 1816. That's known as the year without a summer because it was freezing cold all summer. So it was built by by someone who immigrated from Connecticut. And you can see a lot of Connecticut features in this house. So it was owned by the same family for almost 75 years, but it was empty for the last 20. Can I talk about this, Paul? Is that okay? So when I first looked at the house, it had amazing bones. It was all there. It had a beautiful chestnut post and beam frame. It had wide plank original white pine boards that were milled on site. There was an old sawmill up the hill. But it also had things like drop ceilings, acoustical drop ceilings, layers and layers of linoleum, lots of wallpaper. But it also had some finer elements like some graining you can see on the front door here. It had that vacuum, I had to get rid of it. It had the old heating system, which looked like a Buick, so I wanted to find something that was more that fit with the house a little bit better. This is a picture that you'll see a before and after of. That was the staircase. And the earliest part of the house, to me, I find it fascinating. You can see all the wallpaper and the linoleum and my dog Nugget. He loved it up there. What I loved about the house is that it was remodeled at some point. So I think the earliest part of the house, I went to Cooperstown and did all my history, did all my research. The earliest part of the house is probably from the 1820s. It had a beautiful and sophisticated vernacular Greek revival remodeling some point in the 1840s. And so I took those two cues and built upon that theme. And what I wanted to do was not create a building that was brand new and everything was replaced, but I wanted to retain as much of the original fabric as possible, not only to stay within my budget, but keep the house feeling as if it were an old house. And this is the exterior of it before I got to work. And also to make it look like it evolved over time. So if I was going to add any type of addition to it, I wanted it to look like not exactly that happened in the Greek revival period, but maybe slightly later, or something that might have happened from the earlier period of the house. Has an amazing stone-laid, a stone foundation without grout, et cetera, et cetera. So the house had great bones, and when I did walk through, it had great energy, so it wasn't haunted, so I said, okay, I'm gonna take it. And I did. So this is the exterior before I did renovation. You can see it's actually a salt box, and the salt box was a later addition. The main part of the house with the 4 windows and the perfect facade is part of the earliest section. The front porch is a later addition in the arts and crafts style, and you'll see that I've converted it later. So that's kind of what the place looked like back in the day. And as I started to pull things out of the house, AKA I ripped out the drop ceiling in the main rooms, and I also ripped out the plaster ceiling. You can see they kind of cobbled some pieces together where the original staircase used to be, and you can see the different layers of wallpaper that were intact. But what you can also see is that the original beamed ceiling had been whitewashed, which to me was just like nirvana. I was like, this is a much older house, and here is the proof. And I had to put in a well, I had to put in a septic, I had to put in all new windows, I had to work with all of the trades, I had to have all of the sills looked at and replaced where possible in the most original fashion as possible with large timbers. Had to put in new heating, electric. You can see what the basement or what the bathroom was like. The whole floor had to come out. Everything was rotted, but I did keep the original the fixtures, which were probably from the 1930s. So I kept the original sink when they got indoor plumbing. It used to be spring-fed. And I kept the original bathtub. You can see my whitewash ceiling. I was very excited. And you can also see the creosote around the stovepipe. So this is kind of what was happening. So I had to work with everybody. I worked with an engineer to make sure the house was shored up and everything was good. We had to remove a lot of dry rot. I worked with, some guys who just did all this grunt work and ripped everything out and labored. I worked with an electrician. We had to, upgrade the place to 200 amp electricity. I worked with local plumbers. We upgraded the plumbing system. I had to work with the roofer. We had to put a new roof on, new chimney blocks, et cetera, et cetera. So, for me, I was my own contractor, and I had to hire all the subs. But working with the trade is something that I truly enjoy. And this was sort of a work-build project. And to also get people that are knowledgeable about history and that are able to work in a sensitive manner is very important to me, and it was very important to me on this house. And luckily, I came across the most amazing trim carpenter, who was able to not only replicate, but create new trim work as we proceeded in I'm going to call it a renovation. It's not a restoration, the house. This is what it looked like after. So basically gave the whole place a whitewashing, whitewashed the floors, which had already been painted. I kept as much of the original horsehair plaster as possible. And as far as the interior design goes, you can see it's my classic mix of great modern pieces like the PK22 chairs, which are by the Danish modern Paul Kjærholm, and my take on Americana. So, I got George and Martha hanging on the wall. I've got a great 19th century iron clock. High and low, I've got rush carpets, which were used since the 18th century. Mine, of course, are from West Elm. 19th century oil paintings were possible. Some contemporary sculpture by a local artist. I put in a new fireplace, which is, it's a gas burner. It heats the whole house. But it looks like something that would have been one of the original wooden stoves there. It's a Yodel from Finland. And then I wanted to play with, just the feeling of being in a light, bright farmhouse as well. You can see I have a George Nelson bubble lamp hanging from my exposed beams, which makes me so happy. I have bent wood tonette chairs that I found in a barn sale locally. This is, I think if you go back to the original facade of the house, I wanted to add a little hood over the back door. So I created this Italianate hood. I worked with my trim carpenter, who's amazing. I found the antique brackets in a salvage yard. We created the drops; those are also antique pieces. I worked on the proportions with him, and I've noticed many of these Italianate hoods throughout the town of Otago that have been added on in different periods over time. So I thought this would be a nice addition to the house. And so this looks like something that may have been added in the 1850s or 1860s. So you can kind of see what the house looked like afterwards. This is us constructing the hood. I thought you might like to see some transitional pictures. There's my living room again. And this is sort of what it looks like now after I've done, extensive work with people coming and doing the grading, add a new driveway. The original well is there. It was covered with boards. We constructed a new well around it. I planted flower gardens where Granny's garden used to be. There were some flowers along the south side of the house there, but of course I enhanced that. And this is what the front of the house looks like now. My trim carpenter and I worked on creating a vernacular-style Greek Revival porch, which I think is in keeping with the house. The shutters were actually in the cellar, the original shutters from the house. So what wasn't rotted, we brought up and we restored and painted, added to the facade. You can't see the front porch here, but I was inspired by Hyde Hall, which is a great, Paul may know it, building by Philip Hooker that is up in Cooperstown, New York. It's the only English manor house actually built in America out of local limestone, but they have their porch painted in almost, well, It's actually harvest gold. Don't tell anybody. But they had they had it painted in an umber or a ochre color yellow, which I thought was fascinating. So I did the same on my porch. So I stole an idea. You can see the original 2 marriage trees. Those 2 sugar maples were planted probably at the period the house was built. And you can see kind of what it looks like today. Now, these are photographs that were in New York Magazine in the fall. This is that staircase that I showed you, what I've done to it now. I've always loved op art, so I added some graphic stair carpeting. You can see what the place looks like. That's looking out the front door. You can see I retained the original graining on the door. That's my little dog, Nugget. This was the room you could see behind the rotting velvet curtains, which I've turned into my lounge. It's my little dining room with all of the original cupboards in place. And that's it. So now I'll introduce you to Tamara, and we can talk more about all of this later.
Hi, good evening. I am Tamara Eaton. I'm not the intern. I think, so when I was approached to participate in this book, I think what was really interesting about what Paul said is that a lot of what he's talking about what's happening in New York resonates with me on a day-to-day basis, that I'm seeing this geographic expansion. We're working a lot in Brooklyn, which I'll show you some projects today. But it's very much a renaissance of a community. There's a lot of existing fabric in Brooklyn that I'm finding. And I think the kind of common theme that I'm starting to see, even within the projects in the book, there's this incredible push-pull of what do we keep? How do we insert modernity into that? You know, for a firm like, you see some projects that are truly restoration projects. Then you see some that are just divorced from any kind of sense of tradition. I think we're very much a firm that is anything goes. We have tried to take this approach that is keeping a little bit of that architectural envelope, but then radically inserting some modern kind of wackiness, for lack of a better word. Is that up? Sorry, how do I? Okay, sorry. Wait, no. Okay. Paul's not the only one who breaks things. Can you look at my iPhone later? I'll keep talking because that's my favorite thing to do. So what I'm starting to see in Brooklyn, we work a lot in Manhattan. We work a lot in Brooklyn. When I first started my company in 2009, we were doing some pretty crappy projects, but now we're not, which is great. But we worked a lot in the city, and we had clients who would say constantly, yeah, I'm gonna be here for like 3 to 5 years. So I was like, okay, so we can't spend money on a sofa because it's not gonna fit in the next place that you're gonna buy. We can't do a sectional because, it can't maybe be in the right orientation for the next apartment. What I'm starting to see in the marketplace is that people are investing in a very different way. People are starting to put some really big dollars towards things. we're doing homes that people are now planning on living for the rest of their lives. When we have a lot of clients moving from, and I'm talking about very kind of esoteric things here, but moving from Manhattan maybe to their forever home. So we're now designing 25, 30-year homes for people, and so this is really broken. So, okay. Right, I mean, okay, thank you. Okay, so we're now doing, now we have clients with budgets. Not all of them. I've done my own apartment, which was lack of a budget. But so this is kind of a wild image here. So what this is we have kept the envelope of the house. You can see that kind of oval window in the facade. That is a historic window that we kept, but then there's this radical modern glass and steel. This has no business in this townhouse, but it's super cool. So what we're kind of doing is that push-pull. And I think that that a lot of our clients are up for this play of modern and traditional. There's also a bathtub, this experience of, we're doing a lot of townhouses. What does that mean? So that we have a very traditional sense of what a townhouse is, and it used to be a living and a dining experience, and people used to have astronomical amount of staff, and they were not to be seen. They were to be in the kitchen or up in staff quarters. And so now that doesn't exist in the same way. So we have to rethink how we're living in these historical spaces, which is kind of that really fun push-pull. Most people spend a lot of their time in the kitchen. It's a much more family-oriented experience in terms of how you live. So when you're repurposing a townhouse, that push-pull often has to do with the function and how people live. So that's a lot of what we kind of are thinking about now. This is just looking back into that other room. I love pink, by the way. If that wasn't abundantly clear. Oh, and purple. I like purple too. So this is the master suite. Obviously, we like a lot of color, but you kind of get a little glimpse of that very traditional townhouse staircase. But we have done nothing traditional here except for the molding and the doors and kind of a nod to that. But this was truly a gut renovation with the feel of a townhouse without a ton of the detailing to it, but just kind of a nod. Certainly the facade, this is actually a limestone on 3rd Street in Park Slope. So, and then you see the back of the building, which is quite modern. I think there's a huge divide now between the front and the back. I noticed that Red Top just walked in, so we're doing a project with them, and it's kind of this really interesting push-pull of this very historic front facade, and then that they designed this like fabulous, kooky, modern rear facade, which is I'm sure we'll get that published, so you'll see it then. And then a kind of traditional fireplace, traditional cabinetry, but kind of playfully modern in many ways, and interesting hardware. So. This is also in Brooklyn, but a different project. The projects following now are not in the book, but just kind of our own repertoire. This is on Garfield Place. This was a really interesting house. I'm not sure how many of you know, and I'm not totally the authority on this, but townhouses were built much more developer style, so that when people hear townhouse, they think, oh, gorgeous, beautiful carved interiors, really well built. Not all of them. So there's a lot of kind of B-grade carvings that you can sometimes find. Sometimes actually there's kind of a lot of junk. There's one house I did on President Street that had mother of pearl inlay in all of the woodwork. That was unreal. And they got that house for quite a bargain. This house had some B-grade carving at best. So although the neighbors thought this was iconoclastic to rip out some of it, the architect and I did not. So a lot of this was a very modern insertion. But what was really important to us was keeping the artisan quality. So this hood, which is kind of the whole design here, this hood was, this was a shape that the architect had come up with. And we had thought about a lot of materials for this. He wanted to paint it, you know, kind of like a powder-coated orange. And I said, I think it has to be artisan. I think it has to feel really crafted. So I went to these guys that I know in Brooklyn who are metal workers. I also think they mostly smoke pot, but they do really good metal work. So we worked together to come up with this incredible finish and all of the detailing. So I don't know how to build these things, but I have to liaise tightly with the metal fabrication shop to be able to make these things come to fruition. So I think that a lot of what we try to do is communicate with our vendors and manufacturers so that we're building things that are not kind of wild and crazy, and just the detailing isn't right. So I think in part of our design process, we talk to people and design with our vendors. And so that, I don't know, I think that actually saves me a lot of headache. And then this is kind of the modern traditional insertion. This is the other side of the kitchen. And this image just shows the fridge and then the pantry. This is a piece that we found in London and had shipped over here, but it's this idea of insertion. And so we're really playing here, and this is that kind of push-pull that I'm talking about again. So this room is the front parlor of that. We kept that in a much more historical fashion. A lot of this carving is original. You can see the windows are original, and the casing around it. Very B-grade carving when you get up close to it. I mean, quite amateur. But so we decided to make this just kind of creepy. And the clients their favorite holiday is Halloween. Not kidding. So we kind of did like a Halloween-themed house, I guess. But we had this really whimsical, wild idea just to paint it dark. So it felt more about the feeling of the tradition and kind of detracted a little bit from the B-grade carving. There is actually a really good image of, I think it actually looks nicer now. And that's looking back into the kitchen. So the kitchen never would have been on this level traditionally, so we brought it up here because that's, again, I think that's how people live. And this dining room was informal and formal at the same time. This is another house in Brooklyn that we did, and this is quite a modern house that we worked on, but kind of showing this millwork at the back, that we worked with a millworker and an upholsterer to get all of this coordinated. A lot of townhouses don't have good closets because people didn't have as many clothes back in the day. Now, well, you know, there are hordes and hordes of clothes, even though retail's dying. So we often in townhouses have a closet problem, especially women and shoes for some strange reason. So we have to really be inventive about how we do insertions. We can't, sometimes when we're not renovating a house, we have to insert closets, but not make them feel too modern. So this was a way that we kind of presented a tactile way to include some closets. So there are a lot of just townhouse issues. And then this is the last image that I'm showing you. This was quite a magnificent project on Prospect Park West. It's the closest thing I've ever had to a child. So this was a kitchen, and this was all subterranean. And that cabinet in the back was a tobacco cabinet. And so it's, again, this idea of insertion and the push-pull with traditional and modern, this incredibly modern light fixture and huge island, but then a traditional insertion so that we kind of repurposed this antique piece. So yeah, that's it. And I think, thank you so much for having me.
So We have time for just a couple questions, if there are any. Presumably, Henrika, do you have a question? You don't have a question. Okay. Well, this with Scriven.
Well, Tamara,
Yeah, you should direct.
Tamara, I wanted to ask you during your presentation, those tiered chandeliers looked,
Oh, in the master bedroom?
well, also in the kitchen, in the dining room.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
they almost looked,
like jewelry.
no, they looked A, out of scale, so huge, and B, very kind of modern chintzy. I mean, were you looking
Thank
for
you.
that kind of, I mean, you were
right,
looking for that
okay.
kind of pop sensibility? Or
Well,
what?
I think first of all, I think to each their own.
Chintzy doesn't come cheap.
No, I mean, I'm just saying the look. All those ovals.
Right. Well, that's actually a. I don't know if you're familiar with Italian '60s glasswork, but a lot of. Yeah. So a lot of that is Murano, which is actually a place in Italy where they still blow some of the best glass I think ever. Yeah. That might just be a difference in taste, but I think that I think actually lighting.
That's the look.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions?
Thank you. This push-pull that you were talking about, Tamara, I think that's a conflict that has a lot of people struggling with. I noticed that Paul, in one of the photographs of the subterranean home in a neighborhood that is filled with Tudor, did you have any conflicts with the neighbors or the community officials in building something so modern and so inconsistent with the environment?
I can't speak, well, if you have anything. I believe that was not a historic district, and I believe, I don't know exactly, I believe they did not encounter any until it was starting to unfold.
Oh.
But then it was too late.
Yeah.
And now they're used to it.
Yeah. Well, I think
Does that answer your question?
I think there's a very good
They
and
respected the
Yeah.
the proportions
Yeah.
and the scale.
You know,
they
there's
went
a-
underground so that they wouldn't go above.
there's a lovely entity called the Landmarks Preservation Committee. I think they do, I mean, I don't agree with everything that they do, but I think that there are mechanisms in place, mostly retroactively. You know, that all really started with Penn Station. But I think there's, you know, certainly mechanisms, community boards and irate neighbors and things like that. But I think that there are city mechanisms to keep neighborhoods as they are or not.
And I have one point too. Also, in a streetcar suburb like that from the 1920s, that red that the house is painted is actually a historic color. So that is the color that you would have seen on some of those Tudors and some of the wooden elements originally. So I thought that was kind of a very smart nod to tradition.
I have a, could I just follow up?
Yeah, sure.
I'm asking this question of all of you. What criteria do you use in selecting what to remove, what to restore, and what to completely eliminate or try to reproduce or maintain the original?
Okay, and Chris, but just to your earlier point, and some of you in the classical world know that in fact the landmarks, there's a part of the statute which is of its time. This is a famous phrase, of its time. So paradoxically, a lot of insertions in a historic district must be modern. They must be distinct. So it might seem counterintuitive, and when it's emphatically contextual to the point of invisibility, they often encounter more difficulty. For example, one case in point is at the corner of 72nd and Madison, where the Ralph Lauren built that store, from the ground up, that he had that was barely approved by Landmarks because they felt it was pastiche. So it's a funny. The rules are interesting. But Chris had a point about your.
You didn't get to see many of Mick's beautiful photographs of my place in Staten Island, but we can look in the book later. But what I like to say about that is, and I agree with Tamara that there are some second-rate, there's second-rate elements sometimes, but the house that I live in, everything was so beautifully done, and there was really rich, deep carvings. And of course, I'm a huge fan of the Italianate, and one of the things I love most about it are the rich carvings and the beautiful doors and the heaviness. In this location, everything I tried to do was basically editing. So anything that was added later, I stripped out. Anything that was not appropriate, I felt, or too modern, was taken away so that I could really reduce what was happening in there to expose the original beautiful moldings, perfect and imperfect as they may be, because it's something that I wanted to showcase. Again, was to, you saw that cluttered photograph of what the living room looked like. All of that had to go away so that you could read the moldings. And taking the mantle up that was nailed to the wall in the basement also reproduce something that had been missing in that room for probably 75 years. So I think it's very important to keep what is good and to discard what is not.
Last question. Oh, Henrika does have a question.
And I think that also addresses some of the questions that people here might have, that this is a conversation. Oh, hello. I do like a microphone. Maybe I should stand up. So let me go back and say what I was trying to say. It was more of a comment than a question back to what Paul said about with this book, with this idea of starting a conversation about how people live in New York and how people are designing and furnishing their apartments, whether they be of historic fabric or not. So I just wanted to say congratulations to you for starting that conversation, and that this, I think, addresses some of the questions that a few of you have asked, because it comes down to your own personal lifestyle, your taste, your budget, and the designers who you end up working with have the difficult and challenging and often hopefully successful role in bringing all these kinds of projects to fruition. So I just wanted to make a comment. It's not a question. And you go.
I would like, on behalf of the General Society, to thank Paul, Tamara, and Chris so much for participating in our program tonight. Paul, if this was you below par, you must be absolutely tremendous, and thank you so much for when you're feeling so unwell. So it was fantastic. Thank you for putting everything in context. Tamara and Chris, I want to thank you for so eloquently talking about the push and pull of modern and traditional. It was a wonderful presentation, and I know you probably have many more questions, but I think we will now do that over a drink. But before we do so, we would like to make a presentation to our speakers this evening. And to do so, this is Victoria Dengel, our Executive Director. And I wonder if there's a mobile mic about?
And Paul, to echo Karen's sentiment, well, first of all, I just want to say I've known Paul quite a long time at the Institute for Classical Architecture and Art. He used to be right upstairs, and I loved every minute of you being here, Paul, and all of the wonderful contributions that you made to the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art in making that organization evolve to where it stands today. So always happiest memories of you. And he's a lot of fun to listen to, too. I used to purposely try to run into him on the stairs.
Oh, no Ivanka Trump.
I hope I see Paul today. So on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, We express our gratitude to Paul Gunther, Executive Director, Gracie Mansion Conservancy, and co-author of New York Living, Reinventing Home, for his participation in the General Society Artisan Lecture Series. So thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much.
And at this point, we generally give, oh, it's here? Oh, well, Paul. Yes, and.
Behind your picture frame?
Well,
Oh, that's-
I have it here. And also, we are making you, because we really do miss you, and I've been meaning to tell you, so we've made you a lifetime member of the library in the hopes you'll visit. So, and Chris Kraig, thank you. And I just love that home upstate, that it was resurrected, and you did it with such loving care, and it's it's just wonderful to watch how that evolved, and that you made that beautiful and a warm home once again. So thank you for that, and for your presentation today. So we express our gratitude to Chris Kraig, featured designer of New York Living, Reinventing Home, for his participation in the General Society Artisan Lecture Series. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so nice of you.
Because we like what we've seen so far, we've also made you a lifetime member of the library.
I am, Kim.
It took me 18 years.
I am hanging out here as often as possible. Thank you.
And thank you for your reaction to our building as we toured. And Tamara, thank you so much for your contribution as well, and to your lovely spaces, and for loving pink. We just hope your clients did too. So, on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, we express our gratitude to Tamara Eaton, featured designer of New York Living, Reinventing Home, for your participation in the General Society Artisan Lecture Series. Thank you. Thank you. And your library membership as well. Thank you so much. And we hope that you come and do some research. Our archives go back to 1785, and we also have New York Times bestsellers, so we really cover our bases. Thank you
so much.
Really. Oh, it's been such a pleasure. I want to thank you all for attending this evening. Yes, and I hope you're going to join us for a glass of wine now. But I do also want to mention, because we have a number of other artisan lectures coming up, and I do want to remind you that, like, next week we're going to have a lecture devoted to the restoration of the U.S. Capitol cast iron dome, and that's on June 13th. We have really an amazing artisan called Jean Wiart, who also co-curates this series, and he'll be talking about his fine ornamental metalwork, and that's the 20th. And finally, for this season, on Thursday, June 29th, we have a master artisan of slate, tile, and stone roofing, and that is Yves Thunes. So I do hope you'll come back for that. Thank you so much for coming this evening. And we have to mention one more important thing. First of all, again, thanking the photographer Mick Hales, and of course the absent co-author Gay Giordano and Charles Davey, but also very important, this book, New York Living, is now for sale. So, so again, thank you so much for coming this evening. Thank you. And again, our thanks to our speakers.